Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Walden Art. Today we have a tutorial where I'm going to show you how to use different tools and different techniques and how I do the work. So I'm reporting from Honolulu, Hawaii, and a nice storm in Here's the beach. Let's check it out. So this is my tutorial on how I inked this Punisher piece. The pencils were originally drawn by David Baldeon. David and I, we worked on Web Warriors together. Web Warriors was a comic that Marvel Comics published way before Spider-Man's Into the Spider-Verse movie came out. It was the comic with all the different Spider-Mans and different universes joining together in one story. So when I start inking, I'll use the quill, and you'll see here I'm using the dropper. When I use the dropper, I'm feeding into the quill. Some artists, they would like to dip their nib into the bottle of ink. I think that when you dip your nib into the bottle of ink, you're picking up a lot of ink. So some artists, they would flick excess ink onto another piece of paper to get rid of that extra ink. I don't do that. I would feed my ink. When I'm feeding my ink, you'll see later on in the video, you see me feed again. When I'm feeding, you see that I'm controlling how much ink I'm putting onto the quill itself, and how much ink, when it's too much ink, I'm using the dropper to pull back some ink. So I'm controlling how much ink is on the quill. Now here, when I'm inking, I'll also concentrate on line weights. You don't want to just trace and have the line all the same. Inking is always good to have line weights. Some areas thin, some areas thick. Okay, watch. See how I'm feeding it? I fed just the amount that I need, not too much. And when I'm feeding it, I keep the back of the quill, the top part, the convex part, the rounding part, I keep that clean. That way the ink doesn't dry up. And then when your ink dries up, you're going to spend more time cleaning it. When you're dipping your quills into your bottle of ink, you're going to spend more time cleaning the dry ink that dries up on the top of the quill. When I'm working with a quill, I'm only putting ink on the bottom. So I'm constantly using that ink, and as it dries up, I'm feeding more ink into it. So there's a more flow of ink. That ink on the bottom doesn't dry as quickly as the top part where it does dry, because there's, the top of the inks doesn't get used. So usually when I ink objects, I'll ink, like for example, the nose, that I'll ink the outside of the nose thicker, and some of the inside lines, I'll ink that thinner. The reason I go thicker on certain areas, because I want certain parts of the body to stand out more, like the nose stand out more, but the interior lines of the nose, I want those lines to be thinner. Like if I'm inking the outside of the character's face, I will ink those thicker. Those lines are called the holding line. They hold everything together. Right here, I'm making the eyebrows, and then I would like to add in a few hatch lines. Now, if you're an aspiring artist who's learning how to draw, and you're an aspiring inker who wants to learn how to ink, I can give you one of the best advice. When you're inking a line, do not look at the tip of your brush, or do not look at the tip of your quill. The best thing to do is look at where you're starting to ink that line, where you're starting to draw the line, and then concentrate on where you want that line to be. That way, when you're marking a line, your hand, when you're holding your tool, your hand will have that line go directly to where you want it to end. Now, when you're looking at the tip of your pencil or the tip of your quill, you can even try now. Pull out a piece of paper, get a pen, and then try to draw a line, and then look at the tip of your pencil, and then try to follow that line. When you're following that line, that line's going to be wavy, or it's not going to be as smooth as crisp. Now, if you start drawing a line looking at where the destination is going to be and looking at where you're going to start that line, you would put your pencil on the beginning of that line, concentrate and look at where your destination is going to be, and then quickly with your hand, you can flick your finger or flick your hand, and your hand will automatically give you a smooth line, and it will go to that where you want it to be. You'll be surprised. It will happen. Okay, so right now I'm making the face, a lot of sweeping motion. And then, like I said earlier, I'm concentrating on where I'm starting the line, and then I'm focusing on where I'm going to end the line. Just like these hatch lines I inked on the face. I concentrate on where I want the line to start, and then I focus on where I want the line to end. I don't focus on the journey of the line. I focus on the beginning of the line and the destination of the line. So when I'm inking, I like inking all the faces first. The reason even when I'm working on comic book pages, I'm a comic book artist. I've been working in comics for quite some time for Marvel and DC Comics. So when I work on comics, I like working on the faces first, because if I messed up on the faces, I can get rid of the whole paper and then start from scratch again. Now, if I worked on the whole body and I end up working on the face last and I make a mistake on the face and the face doesn't look right, I can try to fix it with whiteout. But if I can't fix it, I'm just going to end up getting rid of the whole page and then starting over from scratch. So that's one of the reasons why I would always start inking faces first. That's very important. And then when I'm inking faces, I try to make sure every line I ink in, if I'm inking myself or if I'm inking another penciler, I try to make every line as precise as I can, if not better than what the pencils were. When I'm adding these hatch lines, I try to space them evenly. Sometimes you'll be working with another artist who draw lines. The lines aren't spaced evenly or they're wobbly. Your job as an inker is to make those lines as nice and even and uniform as you can. Okay, right here, I'm feeding my quill again. I fed it just enough. And then I'm back to inking the rest of the Punisher's head. So here, again, concentrate on where you want the line to be and focus on where you want the line to end. Now, notice how I did those hatch lines on his neck. Now, when I did those hatch lines, I started exactly on the bottom of the line, but when I ended it in the pattern. The tips aren't one longer and one shorter and one longer. They're uniform. Imagine you're a printer and you're printing a dual tone, like a shade. You want the spacing of the lines to be as even as you can. If it's a little bit off, that tone is not going to look like a tone. It's going to look off. So when I'm making, try to space, especially when you're hatching and cross hatching, try to space things evenly. So here I'm making his fingers next. So the next step when I'm making, working on comics or working on commissions and figures, I would work on the hands. First thing I work on is the heads, because that's very important. Anytime someone look at artwork, the first thing you look at is the heads and the faces. And then the second thing I work on are the hands, because after people look at the heads and faces, they're going to look at the hands. Hands are just as important as the faces. So here I'm using the quill to ink some of the interior lines of the glove. Okay, and here's Punisher's head, and there's the Punisher's glove. And then here I'm cleaning it. Ever so often you're going to have to clean up your rag. Now, if you're dipping it, you've been cleaning up more frequently, but because I'm feeding it, I don't have to clean it as much. So the next step, I'm going to ink things with a straight edge. Here I have this ruler, this triangle, and I have pennies there. Earlier, there were pennies underneath. Now, let me explain why I put pennies underneath the triangle ruler. It isn't to make the ruler more valuable. Sometimes I kid around to people and I'll tell them, do you know why I put pennies underneath the ruler? Is so I can make it 6 cents more valuable. That's not true. I'm only kidding around. The real reason why I put pennies underneath the ruler is because it'll raise the ruler. Now, when you're inking and you're using a straight edge and that straight edge is on the paper, when you apply this ink and then you move the ruler, there's a good chance that you're going to smudge that ink. Because inking with indie ink, it does take a good few seconds for the ink to completely dry. So when I put rulers underneath the rulers, it raises the ruler a little bit. It makes it a beveled edge. And then when you're moving around, you won't smudge the ink. Another thing is I'm using a clear acrylic rulers, so I can see through what I'm working on. Here I'm using stencils. I'm using ovals. Now these ovals, I don't have to put pennies on because you see those white dots. This stencil was made for inking, so it already has these little dots, which makes the template beveled already. So I'm using here the Repeatograph, the Colonel Repeatograph ink. And I should mention, every inking tool I use different ink. For example, this Colonel Repeatograph, I'm using universal ink inside the cartridges of these Repeatograph ink. Earlier, when I was using the Crowquill, I was using a Black Magic ink. So different inks for different tools. I've working in this industry for so long, I find that if different ink work better for different tools. Now, some of you artists who are new at using templates, you'll probably be thinking, there's so many shapes right here. There's like a 20 degree, 30 degree, 40 degree, 50 degree. There's like different degrees and different sizes. In the beginning, when I first started using these templates, it did take me a while to find which size is the right size for that curve. After using it for so long, you automatically know which one, like where to move to. So in the beginning, it does take a while to learn. Right here, I'm using a circle template. And then I'm inking all the straight edge stuff in templates first. This part takes me a little bit because I'm using both my hands. I'm using my left hand to hold the template, and then I'm using my right hand to hold the technical pin. Most of the time when I'm using templates or rulers or ellipses or French curves, I'm using the Repeatograph Colonel technical pin. This template I had for quite some time right now, but it's been working for a long time. So they do last for a pretty long time. Every so often they'll crack, and then you can just get another one or just tape it up on the top and you can still continue using it. So those are the bars on the Punisher's belt. And then I'm going to continue looking for all the other areas on this commission piece that can use a straight edge or templates. We're just going to keep looking for all the areas that I can work on the curves. This way I can get that done and then not have to worry about using templates and straight edges. So most of it is from the Punisher's gun, the barrel of the gun, and then give it a thickness. Now when I'm making the all the stuff that requires templates, I'm also thinking about line weights too. Don't just ink in. So I'm making the barrel of the gun, and then I'm also concentrating on the line weights, which lines are thicker, which lines are thinner, and just doing all the curves. I can do all this freehand, but since I have the template anyway and I'm holding onto the Repeatograph technical pin, I might as well just try to make every line as perfect as I can. I remember a while back when I was working on Iron Man, I would use templates and technical pins to ink every line on Iron Man's body with templates just to give him that more mechanical look. It just makes a big difference. It takes a little bit more work, but it does look better. Now notice I ink the holding line. The holding line is outside of the object. I'll ink those lines a little bit thicker. Sometimes I'll go back and I'll beef up the line. So if one line is not thick enough, I'll go back and kind of ink that line and make it a little bit thicker. So some of the inside lines, I'll just do it once, and then I have that thin line. And I try to make sure those lines are consistent and smooth. Sometimes if you ink one line and then you're going back and then you're beefing up the line, there's a chance that you're breaking up the line. So you want those lines to be as smooth as you can. So look here. Now, here's a method that I developed on my own, and I'm going to explain it to you here on this tutorial. When I'm inking lines and I'm using a template and I want the lines to be thicker, I'll use my left hand and I'll shift the template. You see me shift that template earlier? I'll shift it slightly, and I'll go back and I'll ink that line again. Here, you can watch me do it again. Watch how I do this again. I'll ink in that line. There it is. Okay, so the holding line is thicker, and then the inside line is thinner. See, I'll ink in that line, and then when I do the thicker line, you see my left hand, I'm shifting that template around. I'm shifting that template ever so slightly, and then I'm beefing up that line. And it's a quick, simple shift. I'm just holding the stencil, and then on my fingertips, where I'm inside the holes of the template, I'm just shifting it a little bit. You can see that I'm shifting. So here I'm going to ink all the gun lines first. So those of you who have any questions, feel free to comment down below. I'll respond to all your questions. And if you're interested in trying yourself to ink this exact images, if you're interested in inking this exact image, I do have a Patreon page. I'm gonna have a post on my Patreon where you can download this image. And then I offer mentorship tiers where, depending on what you want, I can give you assignments, and then you do the inking or drawing. And then after you're done, you send me the art and I'll critique your work. And for some of these live videos, I do have the assignments on my Patreon page. So if you're interested in inking this piece and watching me ink it so you can learn from it, feel free to check out my Patreon page. My Patreon page is patreon.com/Walden Wong Art. So check it out. There's different tiers there. And if you enjoy these videos and you're not really looking to be a patron, just want to say thanks, feel free to go over to my Patreon and then show me some support. Anything you decide to support is really appreciated. It helps me with making these videos. And thanks again for watching my videos. So while you're watching me ink the skin, let me introduce myself. My name is Walden Wong. I've been working in comic books for a good long time, since 1996. My first comic book was working for independent publishers, and then I started working for Marvel Comics and DC Comics around the same time. My first DC comic work was Justice League of America, JLA, and in that JLA team book, there's Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Green Lantern, Martian Manhunter, all the cool characters. And then over at Marvel, my first work was X-Force, working in the X office. So I've been working in comics for quite a long time now. Doing comic book inking. I know some of you don't know how the comic book industry works, so I can tell you how the industry work while you're watching this tutorial, and then I'll continue explaining techniques as we go. But right now I'm making some of the lines on the side of the gun. Again, concentrate on how thick your lines are. So working in comics, I'm what's considered a freelance artist, where basically I'm just working at home, and then if a publisher contacts me and I'm working on a project, I just tell them if I'm available, and I'll ask them what's the deadline, and then I'll see if I can do it. Most of the time, publishers will contact you. They'll say, "Hey, Walden, I have this project coming up. Do you have time to work on it? Are you interested in working on it?" And I'll look at the calendar to see if I'm available. And when I am, I just tell them, "Yes, I can work on your project." And then I'm just inking in my home studio. My studio at home, I just have a drawing table and I just work there. That we're considered a freelance artist. Okay, so the gun is pretty much done right now. And then now I'm switching over to a micron. Microns are these fine liner pins. Right here, you can see me using this micron. This micron is a Statler micron. Okay, here's a ruler. I guess I'm going back Okay, I guess I'm going back with the ruler before I use Micron. So I'm going to finish some of the lines that I have here first. So right there, the penciler drew in 2 lines for the logo, but on the left side, he only drew in 1. So because he drew 2 lines on right side, I'm going to make it consistent and add in 2 lines just to be more consistent. So there's kind of like a little outline margin bar around Punisher's logo. Penciler drew it on the left side, but didn't draw it on the right side. He drew it on Punisher's left side, but didn't draw it on Punisher's right side. So I'm going to go back in and then make it consistent and then add double line on the left side of the screen you see there. So I'm using the templates and I'm doing partial arcs. And then I'll pull up the ruler and I'll complete the lines. Usually I also like inking logos and everything with stencils, just because I like the logos to be as perfect as I can. Again, I can freehand it, but why not just use a ruler and make it exactly as precise as you can. So here, pencil drawing 1 line. I'm going to go in and then create 2 lines so it's more consistent. I'll do right here, I'm inking the outside line and then the inside line. So now there's 2 lines. And then using the template, and then I'm finding the right curves. I'll ink in partial arcs, and I'll look for another area to complete the arc. See, it doesn't go all the way, and I'll use the edge of the template as a straight edge. Now, be very careful when you're moving the template around to do this. Sometimes the lines doesn't match up, but so you want to practice a little bit to make sure those lines will work. Find the right curve and then make sure you're placing the template in the right area. Every so often I'll break those lines and then it'll still look okay. Like if you don't want to connect those lines, you can break those lines, but make sure you break it in the right area. When you're breaking up lines, that line will still connect. The viewer who's looking at it, their minds will connect the lines for you. But as an artist, you want those lines to be as consistent as you can. If you want, you can always break the lines. I'll break the lines and I'll add a dot there. That's like something that I like to do, adding a dot when I break the lines. Okay, so continue on with the logo. Okay, so now as I'm working on the logo here, let me explain more about the comics. When comics are done, when we're done, we'll scan it, and then after we're done scanning it, we'll prep it on Photoshop and then do some post-production work, and then I'll upload it to the publishers. The publishers that you work with, they'll have a like a FTP client for you to upload files, whether Dropbox or WeTransfer or FTP. Whoever you work with will give you like some passwords and username where you can upload. Some of the other more independent publishers, you just email to them, and that's okay too. But when you're done with the artwork, usually I'll just scan it. I'll scan it at 600 dpi in color, and then I'll convert it into grayscale. After converting to grayscale, I would adjust some of the tones and adjust some of the contrast and brightness, and I'll make the inks look really nice. And then I'll just save it and then bump it down to 400 dpi and send it to the publishers. So usually publishers will be okay with between 400 and 600 dpi resolution, your scans. And I also reduce it 67%, which is the comic book size. We work on 11 by 17, which is a larger size. But for the comic book size, after scanning it, we reduce it 67%. Okay, there's the Punisher's logo. And then now I'm going to work on the Punisher's, these little baggy sacks. Okay, now I'm pivoting the technical pin here. Okay, you can either find the right template or you can pivot. When you're pivoting, what I'm doing with my right hand, I'm creating the arc. Even though the straight edge doesn't have an arc, but because I'm controlling the technical pin a certain way, you can create that pivot. You can have a straight line, you can have a curved line. when you're working in comics, or when you're working in pen and ink in general, know your tools. Learn how to control your tools. The tools doesn't create the art. The artists behind the tools create the art. So practice a little bit. So if you want this to curve a certain way, look how I'm wobbling my hands over here. Okay. At the same time, I can just sew free-handed, but you know, using a ruler is just so much more fun for me. Okay, look how I'm pivoting the pin on my right hand. Okay, now I'm doing the side of the pouches. So I used one of the curves to measure. Okay, here's one side. I'll ink one line. I'll go back, I'll beef it up. I'm looking at it. I'll ink the line. I want the holding line to be thicker, and I'll go and beef it up. The inner line thinner. See? Sometimes you'll see me using templates and I'm going back over a line. That's because I want those lines to be a little bit thicker. I'm going to continue on with the rest of the pockets. Right over there. And then continuing with the curves. Again, you can use any tool you want. I just like using the repeatograph pen, technical pen. You can use a brush, you can use a micron, you can use a technical pen, you can use a crow quill. There's no wrong way of using it. If you're an artist, I would recommend learning how to use all the tools that's out there, even tools that you've never tried before. When I first started working in comics, the first tool I learned how to use was this exact technical pen here, the repeatograph. This was when I was in high school, and then I learned pen and ink, and then this was the tool I used. So I learned how to use this first. Later on, working in comics, artists would say, you should learn how to use a crow quill. A crow quill nib pen. That's the pen that I used to ink the face earlier. That took me a good few years to learn how to use, because unlike a ballpoint pen where you can draw a perfect circle and you can go in any direction, a crow quill nib, you can't really move in all sorts of direction. It only marks one direction. If you draw that line backwards, you're just going to snag the paper, like I mentioned earlier. It'll snag the paper and it'll snap, and then you create a splatter and you make all sorts of mistakes. After I learned how to use a crow quill, the next thing I learned was a brush. And that took me a while, because originally, before I learned the brush, I was trying to ink everything with a crow quill and microns. And then when I learned how to use a brush, it was just so hard. So I made myself practice using the brush over and over again. Some of the work wasn't that, like, I didn't like the results of how the brush looked, so I just kept practicing and practicing, and then now I know how to use a brush, and it's one of my favorite tools. After I learned how to use a brush, then I learned how to use a micron. And then at the time, I was thinking, why learn how to use a micron? Micron is exactly like a repeatograph pin, this pin that I'm using over here. And as I learned how to use a micron, fine liners, I noticed there is a difference. Let me explain the difference. Unlike these repeatograph pins that I'm using right now, the one that I'm using to ink the gun and the pouches, and when I'm using templates like this French curve right here, I'm using French curve and I'm inking this line here. The repeatograph pin is more fluid. That means when you're inking, the ink inside the repeatograph pin, it flows out a little bit quicker than a micron. A micron flows out a little bit slower. So if you want lines to be more fluid and fast, and you want that line to be longer, I would use a repeatograph pin, like this pin here. So I can ink that line as quick as I can, and the ink will flow out. If you use a micron and you're going really quick and a really long line, you're not going to get that smooth line. But a micron is good for finer details, small little details, and you take your time inking. When you're inking fast with a micron, you're not going to get a smooth line. When you're inking fast with a repeatograph, so more template work, just adding some lines. Some of them are freehand. With the smaller areas, I would just freehand it. And then here I'm switching over to the micron. So notice how I'm using that micron compared to how I use the repeatograph tech pen. With the micron, I move slower. When you're moving slower, the ink flows out better. If you're moving too fast, you're going to get a scratchy look when you're using a micron. So with microns, move a little bit slower, and then you can always build on the thickness. Unlike a brush and a quill where you can apply pressure and create a thicker line and a thinner line, with a micron, you just have a dead line. So what you can do is you can lighten up on using the micron so you can get a thin line, but when you want a thicker line, you would have to just draw two lines and then fill in the rest, or go back and then build up on the line. Again, with comic book inking or any kind of pen and ink, it's always good to do some kind of line weights. So when I'm making hand, every time there's a joint area, I try to make some kind of angle on the joints. That way, there's like an extra bump of ink that sticks out there. This gives the illusion that there's a knuckle there, that there's a bump there. If you look at the outside of the line, you can use whiteout and white out that little bump, and it still inks that line. But because I created that extra thickness on the knuckles, it just gives it more of a depth to the artwork. Now notice the gun trigger. That line is thicker than the line on the fingers. Yeah, I did that on the holding line area, the outside of the hand and the outside of the gun, so the trigger area is in front of the fingers. So right here, I'm building on the thickness of the line weights and then just gliding across, and then I'm focusing on where I want the line to be. If I want certain areas to be thicker, I go back and build up on it when I'm using the micron. And if I want it to be thin, just don't apply that much pressure. Now right here, I'm using the Pentel Aquash watercolor brush. This brush, if you look at the barrel on the top right, is meant to hold water. And the way you use these brushes is you use watercolor pencils. In art stores, they have these watercolor pencils where you would use it like watercolor pencils. I mean, like color pencils. You would just color in certain areas, and once you're done coloring, you would use this watercolor brush. You fill it with water, and then when you squeeze the barrel spits water out on the brush, and then you just apply it on the watercolor pencils, and then those watercolor pencils will become watercolors. That's how this brush is used. But I like the way the tip of the brush is. The brush is a nylon synthetic brush, and it holds its point really well. And on top of that, I don't really need to clean it that much. That's why I like these brushes. So I don't use it for the purpose that it was made for. And a lot of people will ask me, do you fill the barrel with ink? For inking line weights and stuff, I don't really fill the barrel with ink. I just use the tip of the brush just to ink, and then when I need ink, I'll just dip it into the bottle of ink. Now, earlier I mentioned that when I'm using a quill, I would feed the quill with a ink dropper. When I'm using a brush, I would just dip it into the bottle of ink. With the brush, it holds more ink if you dip it in there. Every so often I may add a few drops. I may feed it, but majority of the time, because it's a brush, I would dip dip it in ink to hold more to hold more ink. That way I can ink longer. And even if the brush has a lot of ink compared to the quill, that's okay, because you don't really need to clean the brush as often as you would need to clean the quill. Okay, right now I'm tapering lines. Tapering lines, if you look at the Punisher's hair, there's these sharp points that goes into the hair that turns black, and then when it turns black, it creates another point. Those are called tapering lines, tapered lines. Tapered lines is when you start with a thin point, and then as you go into it, you create a wider line. I like to go from thin to thick. As a good artist, you should be able to go thin to thick as well as thick to thin, meaning you see how I'm pushing the lines into the black? If you have good control, you should be able to pull from the black area into the white area. I'm able to do both, but I'm much quicker with doing from the thin to thick. So I'll just concentrate on where that tip starts, and then when I'm pushing into the black, I'll concentrate on where I want that that negative space, that white triangle to go in. I want them to be as consistent as I can. And then while I'm doing this, because these taper lines are kind of like adjusting angles, I would use my left hand. I would turn the artboard. As you see in the video, you see that every so often the paper is being moved a little bit. Right now I'm inking line weights on the head, the forehead. And here I'm inking some more line weights. Line weights, taper line weights. When I'm making hair, I try to make sure none of the hair crisscrosses. I want those lines to be as smooth as possible, as consistent as possible. So if one curve goes one way, the next curve line I ink, I want those lines to flow along with them. That way it's a softer feel. Like the top of the hair where there's no black area, there's like line weights, but then I'm going zigzagging, but then those tips are getting sharp and getting thin and thick, and then it goes back and forth. And then as I go back to the back of the head, I start tapering again. Now these taper lines, notice that I'm trying to match the flow of the first taper lines that I built on the bottom. You don't want those angles to be like going to the left, going to the right. You want them to kind of point at each other evenly. So the flow of it is consistent from the bottom taper line to the top, to the white area, to the black taper line. Now right here, I'm dipping my brush into the bottle of ink like I mentioned earlier. Now, some of you who are watching this video will probably think, wow, that's kind of gutsy. It's kind of scary. You're bringing your bottle of ink on top of your artwork, and you're dipping the brush directly on top of the artwork. Now, usually I don't do this. When I'm working on my own, I would just dip the brush onto the bottom ink on another table. On my desk, I have one drawing table, and then right next to me, I have another regular flat table. The drawing table I have is roughly 30 degrees incline, so I work in at a 30-degree incline, but then the ink is on another table that's flat. So when I'm working and I'm inking and doing commissions or doing comic book work for Marvel and DC, I would just grab the ink and then dip it away from the artboard, or I would move over and then hold my brush and then dip it on the table. The reason I'm doing it on this video is so viewers like you can see how often I'm dipping the brush or feeding the quill, so you can kind of see how often I'm going back to get ink. And then with my left hand, I'm always consistently turning the artboard, adjusting it, because my hand is comfortable going left to right, comfortable going from my stomach away from my stomach, starting from my stomach, going away from me. Again, if you're a skilled artist, you should be able to do both. I'm more comfortable going away from me. Okay, and there's the forehead. Again, line weights. Sometimes I would follow the penciler's suggestions and then use your language. But if things are off, I would adjust it a little bit, make it look a little bit nicer. I would try not to change any of the pencils because the pencils that was originally drawn is supposed to be there. But what I'll do is I'll try to improve upon the pencils, enhance the pencils, if you will. So right here, those earlier few black areas I dipped in before I started inking, that's for me to make sure that my brush, I can get into the tip. So sometimes before inking that taper line or before inking that line weight, what I'll do is I'll look for in the black area, and then I'll kind of test out the brush after I dipped ink, and then make sure I can get that sharp tip that I want before I start inking the important lines. Okay, so I'm inking and filling in the ink areas as I go. Again, it's whatever you prefer. Some artists, they like to ink all the outlines and then come back and then fill in the ink areas. I sometimes do that too when I'm on a deadline. But when I'm not on a deadline, I like to fill in the inks as I'm inking. That way, when I'm done, I don't have to worry about going back and filling in the ink areas, the black areas. Because when you're inking and you're doing the outline, it just takes like another stroke to finish off filling in the inks. Might as well just do it then and save time and not have to worry about it later. Okay, make sure everything flows nicely. Okay, this arm, there's a line right there. On the holding line, the outside of the body, the outside of the arm, that line is thicker, but as you go towards the inside, that line is thinner. I went back a few times, as you saw earlier, because I wanted that line to be as smooth as possible. Sometimes when you're inking, you get like a few bumps here and there. What I'll do is I'll go back and I'll make those lines as smooth as possible. Thicken up the line a little bit, not too thick. Okay, look how I control how thin the line is and how thick the line is. Okay, control your brush. When you're inking, you don't just move your brush or your tools left, right, up, and down, front, left, right, and back. You also need to concentrate on how much pressure you're applying the brush, how hard you want to press down on the brush, and how light you want to ease up on the brush. When I'm teaching other artists how to create these line weights, these especially the taper lines, I tell them, imagine you're flying an airplane and you want a soft landing. The plane is already flying. As you're landing the plane, the wheel slowly touches the ground. So when you're inking with a brush or quill, think of that same metaphor. What you want to do is you want to ink in the air and you're slowly landing that brush onto paper with a sharp tip. Once you land it gently, you're going to get a very fine hairline, thin line. And then when you slowly press down more, like an airplane landing more, you get a thicker line. And then if you want a line going thinner, it's just like an airplane taking off. The airplane's on the ground. You're lightly easing up, and as you get to the air, it lightly goes up, just like a brush. You're pressing down. You want that line to thin up. You just lift up the brush, and you get a thinner line. Okay, right here, you see that line I'm inking on the shoulder? What I'm doing is I'm using my wrist. I'm not using any finger motion. I'm holding the brush with my finger, but I'm using my wrist to ink in that longer curve line. So when I'm making, I would use either my fingers, like a compass. I would pivot my fingers, or I would lock my fingers and I would pivot my wrist like a compass. And then when I'm using my wrist, I can get longer arcs, or I would lock my wrist, lock my finger, and I would pivot my elbow. When I pivot my elbow, I can get a really smooth, long curved line. And if you're not comfortable with any of those, you can always use the templates such as French curve, flex curve, all those just to help you out a little bit. So right here, I'm tapering lines. Again, concentrate on where that line starts, and then once that brush hits paper, concentrate on where that line ends. Okay, and then the rest is just filling in, inking that line, and then just filling in the rest. Okay, so right here I'm inking the arm. Okay, so if you look at this arm, you notice, well, let's do all these taper lines on the waist area. So the penciler just drew all those. If you look at the lines, the spacing of the boxes, the tic-tac-toes, some are wide, some are narrow. You being an inker or being a better artist, you want to space those lines as even as possible. And then when you crosshatch, all those crosshatch lines that creates a box, think of those boxes. Try to have those boxes uniform to each other. That's when you know that you're doing nice cross-hatching lines. So look at the boxes. See how consistent I'm creating those boxes. And then as it goes into the black, those boxes get smaller and smaller. But it's gradual. So right there, I just created a white line. I inked between... originally when the penciler drew it, there was no white line. The reason I created a white line, this white line is called the halo. Halo is a white line that separates two inked areas. Now, if there was no halo and you were inking the arms, which is black, and then the waist, which is black, both of those blacks will mesh together and you will not see that arm anymore. It will just disappear. So what I've done, I would look at certain areas that I'm inking, and I would think to myself, okay, if this is meshing, what can I do to keep it separate? And what I'll do is I'll create a white line on my own. Even though the penciler didn't draw the white line, I would go in there and add a white line. This way you will show form better. So right now I'm filling in all the ink areas. Even when I'm filling in the ink areas, I want those lines to be as smooth as I can. Right here, remember earlier I mentioned airplane landing? A thin line pressing thicker, and then concentrate on where that line is gonna end so you don't go over the line. You don't want to ink too much and then mess up your artwork. So this shoulder area, pencil didn't draw in the white line. I created that there to add that extra depth to the arm, to separate that muscle. Okay, more right over there, and then I created another halo, just like that. And then here, just filling in more blacks. So yeah, if any of you are really interested in learning from me, again, I have a Patreon page. I'm going to talk about that again. On my Patreon page, there's a few different tiers. Some to thank you for enjoying my videos. If you want to just like contribute $1 here or $5 there to, you know, that's very nice of you. Any donation is very nice. It helps me making these videos. But then I also have different tiers, like higher tiers, where there's a mentorship. Depending on what you want, you can show me some of your own ink work. You can take inking assignments from me where you can download those pages. And then with those assignments, you can ink it on your own. And then when you're done, you show it to me. And once I look at it, I'll give you a full review and critique of your work. There's other assignments where you can watch videos of how I ink that exact same page. You download that same assignment, the pencils, and then watch me ink that page, and then you ink it on your own. So you can actually watch a video, watch how I ink one line, pause the video, and then you ink that same line, and then continue on, like watch again, and then pause the video and watch me ink the same line. And then just like in this video, I have a explanation on why I approach certain areas. So right here, I'm making the waist area. I created a halo, but then all those taper lines, I'm following that flow just to keep it consistent. Flow is very important when you're drawing or when you're inking. Don't just inking taper lines. Don't just draw or create taper lines just for the sake of creating it. Don't be creating hatch lines or cross hatch lines for the sake of creating it. It's not always about making pretty taper lines, not always about making pretty hatch lines or cross hatch lines. Those lines that you create has to have a reason that is there. So continuing the flow of those taper lines and a crosshatch line. That's important. Because without the flow, you're not really showing the form. You're not showing the gray area of the form of the body. So always think about the form. Okay, so I created a white area, inked around it, cross-hatching, tapered cross-hatching. More cross-hatching here. Sometimes it's easier when you're in a rhythm and you get the cross-hatching going on. You just want to go in there and do all the cross-hatch work too. Early in my career, I remember I used to just look at a page and just do all the taper lines. That would be all that I would concentrate on. Just tapering the lines and focus on tapering the lines. When I'm done tapering the lines, then I would go back and ink in all the other areas. Okay, notice how I'm closing up some of those taper lines, because I want those negative points, the white points going into the inked area, I want those to be consistent as much as I can. Now, when you're inking certain areas and the points are coming from a tip, I try my best to create those tips as sharp as I can. If you have a blunt, it's just gonna throw off your whole artwork. So when you're starting a line from an empty space, I always try my best to create a very sharp line. Again, that method is just like inking taper lines. You're landing airplane. You're slowly inking on the air, and you want to land the tip of the brush to the artboard as slowly as you can and create that thin to thick. Or if you go the opposite way, pull up on that brush where your brush is inking a thick line, and as you're pulling up like an airplane flying in the air, that line will go thinner, and then it will just snap itself to a sharp tip. Okay, more doing some detail inking in the panel. Now, if any of you have questions about this video, feel free to ask me questions. If you have questions about a specific part of the video, type in the number, like how many minutes and how many seconds, and ask me then, and then I can look over it and then answer your questions that way. I'm always happy to help. Always happy to answer questions. Okay, again, keep everything flowing and consistent. Yeah, working in comics is a lot of fun. You work at home. Your boss is pretty much your editors that contacts you, gives you a deadline, asks you for pages, returning pages. To be a good artist, you really should be good at what you do. See, these are the three most important points to remember. If you want to succeed in art or to succeed in everything, you have to be very good at what you do. You have to be very fast at what you do, and you should be able to get along with people with who you work with. A lot of people think I'm a fast artist. Oh, right there, when I was cross-hatching, I didn't really like the way it looked, so I filled in black and I added other cross-hatch areas. So sometimes when I'm inking, every so often, like I don't really like the way it was originally penciled to look, but to make it better, I would go in there and like fix stuff. I don't change stuff. I just go in there to enhance the artwork. Okay, so back to those three main points. So working in the comic book industry, or any industry, this applies everywhere. You should be very good at what you do. You should be very fast at what you do, and you should be able to get along with the people that you work with. People should like you. Those are the three main points. You can get by with two of the main points. You can be a good artist and a fast artist. You may not get along with people. You may get work. You may get along with a lot of people, and you may be a good artist and you're slow. You may get work. You can be someone who gets along with someone really well, and you're a fast artist, but you don't draw that good. But you get hired to do those projects here and there. But if you have all three of that quality, then the longevity of your career is good. Not just in art, with anything you do. That applies for being working in any industry. So just remember that. So right here on the pockets, on the far left of the little pockets, it goes from a light gray. So I'm hatching those lines. As I'm going into the dark area, I'm adding a thicker black in between, and I'm tapering those lines. This way, I get a light tone to a darker, thicker tone. Again, every line you ink in, it should have some kind of flow, and there should be a reason why you're inking the line. As an artist, just like a movie director, every scene that a movie director puts in, there's a reason for it. As an artist, every line that you ink in, every line that you draw has a reason. You're not just randomly scribbling certain lines there, especially if you're a comic book inker or if you're doing pen and ink. All the pencils are done. Your job is to make those work, make that ink work better. Every line that was originally there, you need to follow it as much as you can or enhance upon it. Sometimes you may be working on a project and then there's backgrounds. There's a tree back there, or there's leaves. There's like hundreds and thousands of leaves. You may not want to ink the leaves, but it's important that you do, because it's part of the overall image. So it's important, everything that you work on. Don't rush your work. So earlier I was saying that a lot of people think I'm a fast artist. I'm not really a fast artist, but then I do put in all the extra hours just to get the work done in time. Some artists can ink a page like in 2 hours, 3 hours. I spend the time because quality is very important to me. Quality. So the way I make up for the time is I stay up longer hours to get the work done. As long as you're able to meet those deadlines, turn in the project and turn in the pages in time, then you'll be okay. Okay, so right here, on the arm, I'm going from thick to thin, and then thick, and then I'm giving some angles on the outside of the arm, right before the wrist, and then some controlling the. You see how I'm gliding that brush, where when I'm using the brush, my hand is moving lightly, eloquently, softly. So practice on that. It's almost like a dance when you're inking, and then you're flowing that line. Okay, some more tapering lines, and then try to remember where you left off on previous. If you create a halo, try to remember that it was there, and don't forget about it. Because if I ink that shoulder right there without creating a halo, it won't match the area that I inked earlier on top. Also, another thing to keep track of when you're inking, especially with indie ink, where you're using ink that takes like a few seconds to dry. I always pay attention to where I last ink, and then I'll try to keep that area front left away from my drawing hand, because I'll spin the artwork ever so often, and if you're not careful, your drawing hand may touch an area that hasn't dried yet, and you could smudge artwork. So when you smudge artwork, you have to do the work all over again, or you would have to white it out. Now, when I'm working on deadlines and then my hands are moving fast, what I'll do is, instead of inking one page, I will ink 2 pages, or I will ink 3 pages. So if I'm a little bit quicker on filling in the blacks on one page, while I'm waiting for this one page to dry, I'll rotate over to the second page, and I'll fill in inks on that area, or I'll ink in line weights, or I'll do taper lines. Now, as I'm waiting for that area to dry, if I inked in a lot of certain area, and I know that it's going to take a while to dry, then I will rotate to another page. That way, by the time you're done with the second page or the third page, the first page will be dried already, and you can continue on. That way, you don't really waste a lot of time waiting for the paint to dry, watching paint dry. Because no one really wants to sit there and watch paint dry. So try to be as efficient as you can and as effective as you can with your artwork. So filling in the blacks. So right now, around this point, it's been an hour already. So an hour's time, this is how much I've done. So this is a good pace. This is my normal inking speed. Some of the other videos where you see me inking fast, that's just like 2 times the speed. So you can see how the whole image overall. But for this tutorial, I would like for you guys to be able to learn how I do certain lines, why I'm doing it. Okay, be able to curve upwards, curve downwards, curve leftwards. And again, this may be hard in the beginning. It does come with practice. After you practice a while, you get used to it, then you'll understand how the brush works. It's understanding your tools. When you understand how your tools work, your job will be easier. Inking that line, drawing that line. A good rule of thumb is you should, as a good artist, you should be able to use a micron, a technical pen, a brush, fine liners, crow quill, all those tools. All those tools, you should be able to create the same effect, the same kind of line, the same kind of line weight, the same kind of tapered lines, the same kind of cross hatching. Every tool can do the same thing. But each tool can do one thing better than another tool. So remember that. When I'm tapering lines, I like using a brush because it's faster and it's more effective. I can use a micron, but it takes me a little bit longer. I can use a quill, that'll also take me longer. A technical pen, that would take me the longest. It would just take more time. I can use a brush and I can ink in a straight line with a brush using a ruler. That's possible, but it would just take me a little bit longer because there's certain techniques. If you understand your tools, you'll begin to understand which tool works quicker and more effective for another. So don't limit yourself. Try to be able to learn all your tools, and then when you understand, you can make your workflow a little bit better, more quicker. So here, sometimes when I'm filling in ink areas, I do hold the bottle of ink with my left hand, and then I'll start inking with my right hand. And then I'm very careful holding that bottle because the last thing you want to do is spill that bottle on top of your artwork and have to start all over again. So when you need to spin the page, when I spin the page, I'll hold it with the palm of my right hand and I'll spin it. And here, just filling, see, just like that. I'll use the bottom of my right hand and I'll spin it that way. So I don't really move my left hand that's holding that bottle of ink, because the more movement you do with that bottle of ink, there is a good chance that, if you're moving the wrong way, there's a splash ink that would splash out. So be careful about that. I hold it because it's just faster for me. Okay, dipping, and then just inking. It's right there. I was that little tap I did in the blue area. I'm just making sure that the tip is there before I continue on. And some of this just comes automatically. Okay, so far everything is coming on slowly. So I'm inking as close as I can to the logo, and then I'm gonna ink in all the outlines and then fill in the blacks at the same time. Using my right hand to turn the page. You can use your right hand or your left hand to turn the page. It doesn't make a difference. Whatever you're comfortable. When you're working in art, after a while, you develop your own style. You draw a specific way. You ink a specific way. After a while, you understand. Like a lot of artists, they can't tell. Like with a lot of artists, you can tell who drew this, who drew that. I've been inking so long that sometimes I'm looking at someone else's ink work, and without looking at the credits, I know who the inker is, because I recognize their lines, how they approach inking certain lines, or how they break lines, or how they taper lines, or how they make certain lines thicker. It just comes with studying a lot. I like to study as many artists as I can. When I work on a project, I like to be able to speak with the penciler if I can, just to find out what they like with the artwork. And if I can, I would study some of the artists that I work with, some of the previous work, to see what works best for them. And then when I'm inking, I would approach that direction. keep things looking that way. I've gone so far as to find out what certain pencilers would do when they're inking themselves. For example, if they're inking themselves with a micron, a fine liner, then I will switch over and use the fine liner to ink that. It'll take longer, but if that's the look they want, then I'm going to go and do the same thing they want. Just because it's fun. Yeah, for myself, I like learning. So anytime I'm able to study another artist and then learn from what they're doing is great. Now, some of you may or may not know, the reason I do these YouTube videos, these tutorials, is so aspiring artists or people who are already working in the comic industry, that the reason I do these videos so everyone can learn from it. I remember when I was wanting to work in the comic book industry, there was no such thing as comic book tutorials. The way I learned was I went to comic book conventions, and then I would show like my samples, and I would ask the person behind the booth, would you have time to take a look at my work and let me know what you think? That's the way I learned. I went to comic book conventions and I met artists who were sitting behind the table, and I asked them what they thought of my work, and then they would tell me, oh, this is off, this is what I would do, this is what I would do differently. And then I would remember that, and then I would go back home and then try to remember what they said. I may not remember everything, like I didn't take notes, but I remember the major points that they would tell me. Sometimes you talk to the editor, even an editor at a portfolio review. You go to comic book conventions, some comic book conventions, they'll have editors for comic book publishers sitting there, and they'll do free portfolio reviews. What they're actually doing is they're looking at your art to see if you qualify, and then if you're good, they might hire you. So they're looking at your art, and then editors who's been working in comic books or doing art for a long amount of time, they'll know what works, what art style works and what art style doesn't work. So after a while, I was going to comic book conventions and then learning that way. But these days, everything is so convenient for aspiring artists, students who want to learn how to do pen and ink, who wants to learn how to draw. You can just go to YouTube, like this video here, and then learn from it. You can go and read blogs and vlogs, and then learn about that. So, yeah, one of the reasons I started doing these YouTube videos so everyone can learn from it. So if this is inspiring to you, let me know. Comment down below and let me know. Any nice comments you say, I'm always happy to hear. Any bad comments, I'm always happy to hear, so I can learn from it. Recently, some of the old videos that you see me doing tutorials, I would have background music. This is going to be the first video where I'm not going to have any background music, just so you guys can concentrate more on the tutorial. Probably some of you guys are falling asleep because there's no music, but we'll see what happens. So if you like music, comment down below, let me know. If you prefer this way without the music, comment down below and let me know, and I'll respond. Because any feedback lets me know what you guys prefer in watching my videos, and I would do more gearing towards the way you guys like it. So I'm pretty close to finishing up this Punisher commission. Just a few more lines left. Filling in dark areas, just inking around the line. This is the easy part. Just do the outlines first and then come back and just fill it in. Control your brush. Make sure you don't smudge any of the ink areas. Make sure everything is dry. Okay, make sure all your lines are smooth. Don't have any wobbly lines. Don't have any bumpy lines. Smooth lines are the key. Consistent line is the key. Taper lines, which is spaced evenly, those are the key. Hatch lines that are spaced evenly, that's very important too. So all of that is very important. Okay, here's the arm. Ink all that in, and then filling in all the blacks, and come back and then dip the brush and start filling it in. So at first, when you were looking, after I dipped the brush, I was there was a little hesitation. The reason I did that was I was with my eyes. I quickly scanned the page to make sure all the areas are dry first before I move any closer, because I don't want the bottom of my right pinky to touch any area that's wet. So the ink does dry pretty quickly. Maybe a good, depends on how much ink you plop down. If you plop down a really thick amount, it'll take longer. But if you have just the right amount, it can take maybe 10 seconds to dry. It's not that bad. And then I'm inking away, like away, towards my body. So that way, this part, you're going to see me filling in the blacks. And then you're going to notice that some of the ink area, there's going to be globs of ink, which is reflective. Those parts of the ink will take a little bit longer to dry. So pay close attention to where you just ink. Sometimes you can be deep in focus with your artwork that you may forget. So a good rule is to keep everything away from your drawing hand. So if you're right-handed, make the ink area that you just inked on the top left side. If you're left-handed, make sure the ink area that you just inked is on the top right side. So away from your arm. Make sure that's away from your arm. Look how thick that ink is. It does a gloss over there. That part is going to take a little bit to dry. So I'm filling in all the edge first, and then quickly using a brush just to fill everything in. Sometimes there's a big glob of ink there. I'll just go back and I'll pull some of that ink and I'll continue filling in all the other black areas. Okay, at the bottom of the arm, make sure it points to the tip. Try not to make mistakes. If you're too fast, sometimes you go out the line and it's not really that good. Try to stay inside all the lines that you inked. And then if it moves out a little bit, that's okay too. But try to be consistent. Okay, fill in the blacks. When I'm inking, I'll use the tip to fill in, to ink and do taper lines. When I'm filling in black, sometimes I'll push down on the brush and I'll use the side of the brush. You'll see here, I'm inking with the tip, going from there to there. And then when I'm filling it in, I'll press down with the side of the brush, just so I can get a thicker amount of ink to cover up all the pencil areas that needs to be inked. Yeah, so you see the ink is flowing down. It's because I'm working on an inclined table, so I have to remember where the ink is moving too. Like if it's too much ink, that ink's gonna run off the page. So try to focus on where you last ink, how much ink you're applying, and then if it's dribbling or dripping, go back and then pull that ink away so it doesn't run off the page or run off the areas that you're inking. Now here I turned it around, turned the artwork around, and I'm gonna ink some of the waist area. Again, see, I turned the whole artwork around where that wet area is away from my arm. It's on the away from my drawing hand. That way, there's no chance of me smudging over that. And then I'll continue filling in the back area. And check out the speed I'm doing this. Not too fast, taking my time. Not taking too long of the time, just making sure everything is done nicely, because haste makes waste. If you're rushing and you pass a line and you have to fix it, pulling out your white out and then whiting that out and then re-inking it, that just takes a little bit more time. So try to be as accurate as you can with filling in blacks. This is actually the easy part. Okay, right there you saw me pulling my brush and then pulling some ink from some of the wet areas. See, and then be careful right over there, making the line smoother again, and dipping some ink and continuing to ink, filling in all the areas as quick as I can. And again, for those of you who are learning, it may look like I'm fast, but again, when I first started inking, I wasn't this fast. It does take a little bit of practice. The more you practice, the better you'll get at controlling your tools. Look, the arm is still like a lot of wet. So that's normal. That's normal. Just let it dry. If you want it to dry faster, you get a brush and kind of like wipe over some of the drip areas so it'll dry faster. Set gloss, so be careful. If you were to sneeze and then right in front of the artwork, that ink would like flow. It would just flow off the ink areas that you don't want to touch. Okay, fill in more of the blacks. More black area, and then we're almost coming up to the near finish. Yeah, so I hope you guys do enjoy this inking tutorial as much as I enjoy creating it and explaining how I approach inking this. I'll be doing more in the future. So if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel. Like the videos, make some comments, share with some of your friends, share with some artists that you know, artist friends, or if you know someone who wants to be an artist, even if it's just an artist that's learning how to use inking tools, share with your friend. I appreciate all you share. Thank you very much. Also check out my Patreon page and also check out my website. I'll add all those links below in the video. So check out my website. In my website, it'll have links to all my other social media. Check out my Patreon if you want to support me in making these videos, or if you want to be have a mentorship with me where I can critique your work and help you out with your inking or drawing or coloring or writing. And then right here, this is the last of the inks. Once I fill this area, I think the rest of the page is pretty much done. Okay, be very careful. The last thing you want to do is make a mistake right when you're about to finish, because it has happened to me as well in the past. Okay, just take your time finishing it. You're at the home stretch. Turn the paper. Well, it looks like on the bottom left, there's the gun area that I need to ink later. So fill that in. Fill in the rest, fill in all the blacks first. Okay, and then now we're going to check out the rest of the artwork and make sure the head is dry. And then fill in the gun area. Dip some ink. Fill that in. Make sure the ink doesn't run. Ink away from my body. Make sure the ink is away from my arms so I don't smudge it. If I need to turn it, so make sure I don't smudge it, stay inside the line. This is the easy part, pretty straightforward. And then that's pretty much the whole commission piece, all inked. Over there. Now I'm gonna ink in David Baldeon's autograph, his signature. So that's what he signed. So I'm pretty much tracing over his lines. Fill that in. So doing comic work, if, for example, if I'm doing a cover for Marvel or DC, and then the pencilers sign their name and they sent that to me in a digital file, after I'm done inking, I would have to ink their name. That way their name will show up. Okay, fill in some of the back areas while I'm waiting for it to dry. See, some of that extra glob, I'm just going in there and just like swiping it, and then that way it will dry quicker. Like if you have a glob of ink and it's taking a while to dry, just go back in there with a brush and then fill it in and it will dry quicker. And then every so often, sometimes I'll like to go back and then add more inks to make the black area more dark. Just so the collector, whoever ends up owning this page, the person who's commissioning me, or if I'm working on an original Marvel page or DC page, when I'm done, whoever owns it later, like if it gets sold and someone owns it, I would like for them to have a nice, complete, a solid ink page. That way, just there's no gray areas. So I like to make sure everything is nice and solid and crisp. So right here, this is pretty much it. And then fill in more of the black areas. Now, when I'm filling back areas, you still need to be very careful because sometimes I'll find areas I want to fix, just like here. Um, just make sure everything is consistent. Like if you're moving too fast, there's a chance. I remember back then when I would fill in back areas, I would do that really quickly, and then the brush would kind of like make a mistake. So that's it with the brush. I'm putting that away, and then next step, I'm gonna sign my name. Okay, again, the artwork just fell. Actually, no, it looks like there's some whiskers. I'm going to pull out the micron and then ink in some of the whiskers. Again, consistency is key. When I'm inking the whiskers, I would just space them evenly apart from one another. Every line, I want the distance from where it starts to where it ends to be kind of consistent. Imagine you're a computer printer and you want to print these gray lines. You want those to be consistent, just like how a computer would print it. If you're too random, it's going to take attention away from the whole artwork. You want to be as precise as you can. Some of these whiskers I'm making outside of the line, so it looks like it's growing on the outside. Right over there, just add a few more whiskers. Okay, and then it looks like some of the hand, we're going to go back in there and ink in some of the lines. I'm just going to use the micron just to finish up. Again, you can use a brush, you can use a crow quill nib, you can use a technical pen, but right here I'm just using a brush because I just want to get this done. And with a brush you can with a quill you can, again, like I mentioned earlier, you can use pretty much any tool to create the same line. I just have with me a micron, and I figured that it would just be faster to get that done. Notice that even with the micron, I'm flicking the tip of the micron as much as I can to create that quill look. See, you see how I'm flicking it? I'm inking a line, I'm doodling it, and I'm flicking it. So this creates a crow quill look. And then some of the hatch lines and the cross hatch lines on the gun. Again, space them evenly. Start in the right area that you want it to, end in the area that you want to. When you cross hatch, make sure those diamond shapes on the gun are consistent with one another. And then because there's some of that diamond shape up there, I'm going to add some diamond shapes down there too. It wasn't penciled in, but it'll look better that it's inked in. Make sure your cross hatch lines are consistent with the lines on top. And then some more little minor details. A little bit here, a little scratchy details here and there. Give it more form. And then on these bars, just a few more just to make it look nice. I'll ink in the line, wobble it, and draw a line and end that wobble in the other pouch. See, notice all the areas are dried right now. So that's how fast the ink dries. Inking some of the seams on the outfit. And then once all that's done, I'll usually look at everything, make sure I don't miss any lines. If I miss any lines, I'll add it in. Maybe add some of my own lines, make it look better. And then finally, I'll end everything by signing my name. I'll need to get a thicker micron. I put away that the finer micron. That micron I was using was like a 0.005, and now I'm using a thicker one because the signature is so thick. And then I'm going to ink in the outline and then sign his name. Sign David Balden's name over here. Okay, just follow his lines as precisely as I can. I ink all the vertical lines first, and then I'm concentrating on the other lines that he drew. Turn the Bristol board around, and then ink in all the other vertical lines. It's off camera now. Sometimes the camera's not shooting. So ink in those lines, and then ink his signature, and then finally I'll finish off the whole piece by signing my name, which is the easiest part. I'm not really following any lines. I'm just signing my name. There you go, and that's the whole piece. So let's take a look at this Punisher piece, this completed Punisher piece. Here it is, all done. So start from the bottom. Let's take a look. See the nice amount of ink, the nice reflective part of the ink. And then this is it, David Baldeon's Punisher, pencil by David, inked by me, Walden Wong art. And that's it. And then once I'm done with the commission, I'll take another look, make sure everything's done. Make sure I didn't miss any lines. Take another look. And after it's done, I'll take my little pad and I'll stamp it on the commission's inked by Walden Wong. So I have that. So there you go. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, subscribe. And until next time, keep on doing your work and eventually you do great work. Thank you very much.